Good afternoon to every one of you here on today. As mentioned, I am Reverend Tess Powell, the founder of Perfecting Community Full Gospel Baptist Ministry. Now, as the founder of Perfecting Community Full Gospel Baptist Ministry, I believe in empowering and rebuilding communities. One of my areas of concern is that of community outreach. I initiated a project to assist in restoring the fullness of African Americans, which includes changing the negative perception of our people in the United States and abroad, embracing our rich culture, building social economic prosperity, and encouraging religious freedom. This ministry is called the Community Change Agent, with one of its functional scriptures being Psalms 139:14. You know, the part that said we're fearfully and wonderfully made. The Community Change Agent Ministry is a subcategory of Perfecting Community Full Gospel Ministry, and it is designed to assist with building and restoring disenfranchised, marginalized communities. Now, our target audience are females from age 8 and older. I elected to include the youth because I desire to assist with molding young minds for future success and empowering them to teach others to do the same. Now, before we begin, as was mentioned earlier, Ms. Forlaw had given the housekeeping rules, and I just want to remind you and reiterate, if you will, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the chat box, and as the presenters conclude, I will begin to read them, and we will begin to answer as many as we possibly can within the time we have allotted. Now, as mentioned already again by Mrs. Forlaw, today we are here to uplift and honor the stories of two fascinating but not well-known African-American suffragists for women's rights to vote, Mrs. Emma France Lancaster and Mrs. Alice A.L.T. Waytes. So now we would like to transition into our program. We are honored to have with us on today Dr. Thomas Dublin. He is a distinguished professor emeritus from the State University of New York at Binghamton as the presenter for Mrs. Emma France Lancaster. Professor Thomas Dublin is a retired historian who taught for 40 years at the University of California, San Diego, and the State University of New York at Binghamton. He focused his writing and research on U.S. labor history, women's history, and immigration history. He is currently editing the online biographical dictionary of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. I present to you all Professor Dublin. Professor Dublin.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. For a decade now, I've been examining the work of Black women suffragists and the role of religion in these women's social and political activism, and that's particularly striking. This afternoon, I'd like to talk about an activist woman who helped frame my understanding of this connection, Emma France Lancaster of Portland, Oregon. Lancaster is one of the many obscure grassroots activists, basically unknown and unappreciated by historians, whom I have discovered in the course of my larger project. Let me begin by describing how my research has evolved, and I'll focus on this suffrage activist. For over 20 years, I served as co-founder and co-editor of an online journal and database, Women in Social Movements in the United States. Beginning in 2008, I collaborated with the late noted historian, Rosalind Terborg Penn, and together we began to construct a database of the writings of Black women suffragists. We began posting scans of these writings in September 2014, drawing initially on the writings of some 70 Black women suffragists. That collection now includes more than 2,100 writings by more than 300 activists. As I was working on the writings project, Jill Zenizer approached WASM with a proposal to publish an online database of militant women suffragists who had picketed the White House in 1917 to 1919. Dr. Zenizer supplied an Excel spreadsheet of some 224 militant suffragists. She worked up 6 exemplary sketches herself, and we solicited interested readers to crowdsource biographical sketches for the remaining activists. As this work proceeded, we kept assembling the writings of Black women suffragists and kept discovering new Black women. They were mentioned in scholarly books and articles. They appeared in newspaper accounts of suffrage meetings, parades, and lobbying. At this point in the process, we've identified 400 Black women suffragists, and our group of militant suffragists that has grown to 420. Once we were working on these two groups of suffragists, it seemed important to expand the project to include mainstream suffragists associated with the National American Woman Suffrage Association. This was a much larger group of suffragists with branches in all 48 states. Looking for a contemporary source, we discovered that volume 6 of the History of Women's Suffrage consisted of more than 700 pages of state reports on women's suffrage activity in all the states between 1900 and 1920. From that source and building off of it, we recorded the names of some 2,800 local suffrage activists associated with NAWSA. These decades corresponded roughly to the period of greatest activity for the National Women's Party and for Black suffragists, and this made possible comparisons and contrasts among the groups. The expansion of the project was logical, but perhaps a bit foolhardy, given that our database now promised to include more than 3,600 suffrage activists, and we were committed to finding volunteers to write those sketches. We drew on a disparate group of volunteers to research and write the biographical sketches. We advertised on various listservs, on Facebook, in H Women, the National Women's History Project, the American Association for State and Local History. We wrote to college and university faculty, encouraging them to offer an assignment in one of their classes to have students write biographical sketches of these suffragists. Faculty members typically integrated the assignment into their course syllabus and prepared the students for successful engagement with the project. Faculty often involved a reference librarian to offer a hands-on library research workshop to acquaint students with available online, archival, or printed resources. Finally, the most engaged of the faculty spent considerable time after the course was completed, copy editing and fact-checking their students' work, often doing research themselves to enrich the sketches. As the COVID-19 pandemic hit this past March, college students had more difficulty completing their sketches, and I began to research and write some myself. In addition, I came to rely more and more on our most experienced volunteers, especially retired librarians and teachers who had more time for research and writing during the pandemic. An experienced core of authors emerged in these months, and the quality of the resulting sketches increased as well. Given my long-standing interest in the reform work of Black women suffragists and the difficulty of writing their sketches, I focused much of my effort on this group. As I anticipated drawing broader conclusions from the individual life stories, I found the work of Martha Jones particularly helpful. In her writings, including the most recently published book, Vanguard, Professor Jones has brought into her treatment of Black women's voting rights an appreciation of similar rights struggles within the 19th century Black church. She shows how the work of Jarena Lee, Eliza Gardner, and others contributed to an expanding role for women in the Black church, and then how those gains led to similar efforts in the secular world of politics. In the process of reconstructing the lives of grassroots suffrage activists, I found many life stories that reflected the larger pattern that Professor Jones identified. Let me now turn to one of those stories. Emma France was born in 1859 or 1860, probably enslaved, in Alabama, and by 1864, she was orphaned, residing in a contraband camp organized by Union troops along the Mississippi River in Helena, Arkansas. Major General Buford, commander of the troops, arranged with the Indiana yearly meeting of the Society of Friends to establish an orphan asylum to care for the numerous homeless youngsters in the camp. Calvin and Elida Clark, described as, quote, devout friends, strong abolitionists, and devoted Republicans, unquote, volunteered to set up what became the Helena Orphan Asylum. 3 years later, the asylum and its associated school had moved to an 80-acre site some 9 miles from Helena in Phillips County. Over time, the school expanded and took the name Southland College, continuing through the 1920s under the sponsorship of the Indiana Yearly Meeting. One of the first orphans whom the Clarks took under their wing was 5-year-old Emma France. The 1870 census shows 11-year-old Emma living in a group household headed by Calvin and Elida Clark, the superintendent and matron of the school, and 14 other students. With the departure of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1869, Southland focused on a normal course to train Black teachers. And by 1874, the school had put 60 teachers, quote, in the field. Emma France was among the first graduates in 1876 and continued to live at Southland, where she worked as a teacher, helping, as one historian put it, to fulfill, quote, Matron Clark's dream of seeing the school conducted by colored teachers who were Southland graduates. Living nearby in the household of Amasa and Lydia Chase, 2 New England Quakers who came to Arkansas via Kansas, was Anderson Lancaster, a mulatto laborer originally from Kentucky. Amasa Chase was a physician and farmer, an active abolitionist earlier, and now an evangelist and temperance advocate. His wife, Lydia, became president of the Arkansas Women's Christian Temperance Union and may well have influenced Emma's later reform inclinations. In 1885, Emma married Anderson Lancaster, and the couple settled near Southland, where Anderson worked as a mail carrier and Emma as a teacher. Her daughter Ruby was born in 1890 or 1891, and 2 other children died young. As a star graduate of Southland, Emma was invited back in 1885 to give the commencement address, which she titled Employment of Women. Elida Clark commented proudly on the speech in a letter she wrote shortly after the event. Quote, Emma's words, she said, should serve as a powerful demonstration to the men that women are their equals, and when allowed a chance, their superiors. Clark underlined in this letter the words equals, superiors, and then finally women. Emma had a strong example of a committed feminist in her Quaker teacher, Elida Clark. It must have contributed to her later activism. Emma became a devout Quaker, and by 1888, she was serving as clerk of the Southland meeting of the Society of Friends. By 1905, the Andersons had moved to Portland, Oregon, following Daniel Drew, a Southland graduate and a, quote, popular evangelist, quote, in the period that Emma France was a student and a teacher there. Drew was, quote, recorded as a minister of the Society of Friends, unquote, in Southland in 1880, and he began ministering in the Oregon Yearly Meeting in 1901. And so he would have been well established there when Emma and Anderson arrived 4 years later. Emma Lancaster's religious perspectives broadened in these years. She began as a member of the Southland Meeting and then the Oregon Yearly Meeting, a logical choice after spending at least 16 years in Southland with its Quaker sponsorship. But in 1907, Daniel Drew, quote, transferred his membership to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, unquote. And a newspaper account indicates that Emma's daughter Ruby and Drew's son William spoke at a reception for the pastor of that church in November 1909. Emma's connection with the AME Church provided a basis for her growing activism in the Portland Black community. Emma Lancaster's first evident political activity came in 1912 at the start of Oregon's fourth campaign for women's suffrage. The three previous campaigns had been defeated, and Oregon's women's suffrage movement was sharply divided by the imperious leadership in these years of Abigail Scott Duniway. Votes for women's suffrage had declined across the three failed campaigns from 44 to 37%. In 1912, illness kept Duniway in the background, and a diverse coalition of groups came together in support of women's suffrage, including the state's farmers' organization, the Grange. One historian has counted 23 suffrage organizations in the Portland area in 1912 and another 8 endorsing organizations. These include the Men's Equal Suffrage Club and the Portland Women's Club, both endorsing women's suffrage. A broad coalition of groups emerged to back the campaign, including Chinese American and Black suffragists. Out-of-staters joined the campaign as the absence of Duniway encouraged activists from the National American Woman Suffrage Association to lend their support. NAWSA president, the Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, made an appearance in September. In the November vote, fully 52% supported women's suffrage, an increase of 15% over the 1910 tally, and women won the vote. In early 1912, members of the city's 3 Black churches came together to form the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage League, which joined in this suffrage campaign. Emma Lancaster served as the league's vice president, and a representative of the CWESL worked with white suffragists on the state central committee, coordinating the statewide effort that won the vote. When the Central Campaign Committee issued proclamations on the eve of the election, they did so on behalf, quote, of presidents of all the suffrage organizations in Portland, which pointedly included the Colored Women's League. Emma Lancaster's activism continued after Oregon women won the vote. By September 1916, she was active in the Colored Women's Republican Club, speaking in support of prohibition. In August 1918, at an event sponsored by the Rosebud Study Club, one of Black women's clubs in Portland, Emma was among those hosting Black inductees heading off for military service. She was also a member of the Lucy Thurman WCTU, a colored branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She served as its secretary and also was in charge of mothers' meetings and press work. Also active in the organization at this date were 3 other suffragists, Catherine Gray and her married daughters, Ethel Gray Turner and Edith Gray Williams. Well, what broader interpretation might we draw from this individual life story? Clearly, religion was a powerful force in shaping Emma Lancaster's reform commitments. Quakers exemplified Protestant dissent against state-established religion, permitting and valuing individual spiritual expression. From the late 18th century, Quakers were at the forefront of religious opposition to slavery, hence prime candidates to answer the call of a Union general to come down to Arkansas and establish an orphan asylum and later a school for black children at the end of the Civil War. The Clarks shaped Emma France's education and her religious development, and the Chases most likely shaped her reform interests. Even after she left Southland College, Emma remained active as clerk of the Southland Quaker meeting, and in their migration to Portland, the Lancasters followed the lead of Quaker minister and evangelist Daniel Drew. The Quaker connection no doubt influenced Emma's later interest in women's suffrage, evident as she served as the vice president of the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage League, and later in the Colored Women's Republican Club. Quakers developed a religious structure and practice that was democratic and consensual, paralleling the growth of democratic political expression in the American Revolution and then well into the 19th century. This religious tenor meshed well with suffragists' opposition to the tyranny of male political dominance over women. From the limited evidence that has survived, one senses an ecumenical dimension to Lancaster's religious practice. In 1907, she followed Daniel Drew and joined the AME Church. And 2 years later, her son and his daughter spoke at a reception for the new pastor of that congregation. Emma may well have sought a stronger connection to Portland's small Black community at this time, and the AME Church would have offered such a pathway. And the Black churches in Portland, the AME Zion, and the Baptist all took a lead in supporting women's suffrage. They sponsored the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage League, which met in these churches on a rotating basis. Still, Emma did not give up her connection with the Quaker meeting, and when she passed away in October 1925, her funeral was held at First Friends Church in Portland. Emma Lancaster's story is underscored by many other accounts that emerge from the suffragist biographical sketches that we've assembled in the online biographical dictionary. These life stories reinforce the conclusion that Martha Jones drew in her book, Vanguard. And I'm quoting now, "Just as political debates informed their religious deliberations, women's work in churches was a route to rights consciousness, an occasion for honing argument, and a proving ground for their capacities for leadership, governance, and even political wrangling. In this, there was power." There are similar stories for women's suffrage activists throughout the online biographical dictionary within the Baptist and the AME church traditions. The path to support of women's suffrage by African Americans ran through Black churches and the Black club movement. And at the same time, the trajectory was continued in the century that followed the passage of the 19th Amendment. Black women suffragists were major actors in the founding and early years of the NAACP. White opposition in the South to Black women's voting rights meant that the Black women's suffrage movement, by necessity, became a decades-long civil rights struggle that continued through the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And the legacy of the Black suffrage activists I've examined here is visible still today. They launched traditions of civic engagement that showed the way for Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, and Stacey Abrams today, who have brought these citizenship struggles into our own time. Whether it is the Black Lives Matter movement or today's fight against voter suppression, the struggles launched by Black women suffragists are still being fought fully a century later. And now let's return to Reverend Powell, who will introduce our next speaker.
Wow, what a powerful bit of information that you have shared with us on Mrs. Lancaster. I know I've just learned quite a bit, and I don't know if you all noticed, but I have on my I voted button because I just did my early voting here. So how appropriate are the women that are being spoken of on today as we're in this season. So our next presenter, so thank you. I don't want to, thank you Professor Dublin for that information and introducing us, well, introducing me, I can say, and some may already know about her, Mrs. Lancaster. Our next presenter is no stranger to the Religious Freedom Center. Mrs. Blair Forlaw is a contractor of the Leadership in Multi-Faith Democracy, Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum. As the presenter, she is our presenter for Mrs. Alice A.L.T. Waytes. Mrs. Forlaw is an enthusiast for free choice and lifelong learning. Her professional background is in talent development as a strategy for economic growth, positioning her to design and lead initiatives at public and private metropolitan planning agencies and nonprofit organizations. That's dear to my heart. She has been a tour guide at the museum, an interpreter at the DC Historical Society at the Carnegie Library, and a volunteer citizen researcher with the online biographical dictionary of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. I present to you all Mrs. Forlaw.
Thank you so much, Reverend Powell. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce you and our audience to the life and times of Miss A.L.T. Waytes. Like Emma France Lancaster and so many other persistent, faith-driven women in our history, Miss A.L.T. Waytes is little known and hardly ever celebrated. But you and I have a chance to celebrate her today. This is the only known photograph of Alice L.T. Waytes. It's a poor quality screenshot, as you might note, of an article that appeared in the Denver Star, a prominent African-American newspaper of the day in 1916. There's little that we can tell about Miss Waytes from the introduction to this article, although there are some key words: prominent, successful, wide experience, that draw us into her life. But it doesn't really tell us that much about her. And so I looked for other ways in which I could effectively illustrate to you the life and times of Miss Waytes. I found a wonderful digitized collection of photographs, and I recommend this to anyone who's interested in doing your own research. The Library of Congress has a wonderful digitized collection of photographs, and within their larger collection are more than 200 photographs assembled by W.E.B. Du Bois as part of an expo for the 1900 exhibition in Paris. W.E.B. Du Bois, as you know, was an African-American sociologist, writer, teacher, and activist, and he wanted to demonstrate at the Paris Expo the history and the present conditions, he said, of African Americans. And so these photographs, I figure, if these are good enough for W.E.B. Du Bois, as far as describing the present condition of African Americans around the turn of the century, then they're good enough for us. So what you're going to see today in my presentation are a number of photographs that were taken from the Library of Congress collections, both that put together by W.E. Du Bois and some others. So bear in mind, these are not pictures of Miss Waytes, but these are photographs that are representative of some of the places Miss Waytes went, some of the things that she did, and many of the challenges that she faced. Now, as we go through her story, you're going to notice and you're going to recognize a number of themes and realities that were an important part of life for Miss Waytes and others who lived in her time frame. Some of these are themes that we all read about in history books. Some of them are realities that we've learned about since. And it's very important for us, I believe, to know about these themes. Somehow or other, though, they come to life much more effectively in the course of a person's story than they do when we read about them in the history books. So I encourage you, as we talk about Miss Waytes, to listen and learn from these themes. I first met Miss A.L.T. Waytes when Dr. Tom Dublin referred me to the September 1912 edition of The Crisis. The Crisis, as you probably know, is a monthly journal of the NAACP. And its editor, here we are back with W.E.B. Du Bois, its editor noted in this edition on women's suffrage, quote, "In Boston, Miss A.L.T. Waytes of that city tours the country in the interest of votes for women." A search of the Black press of the day found that Miss Waytes seemed to be everywhere, in fact, speaking in the interest of votes for women. The Atchison, Kansas Daily Globe, for example, took note of her in September of 1912, saying, "Miss A.L.T. Waytes of Boston, who is said to be the only colored woman in active campaign work for votes for women, is doing splendid work among the Negroes in Wisconsin." That same year, the Nashville Globe reported that Miss Waytes' speaking engagements had, quote, been met largely with success, and invariably numbers have heard her with a marked degree of satisfaction and benefit. And in St. Paul, the Appeal noted that Miss Waytes had recently given, quote, a most excellent address filled with wit and wisdom. She spoke in open air meetings on church grounds, in small churches, in large chapels like this one at Fisk University, and to groups of students at HBCUs such as Roger Williams University in Nashville. Hopefully on the next slide. Between 1912 and 1916, Miss Alice Waytes spoke to audiences in more than 13 states. I'm going to read out a list of states to you, and I want you to see how quickly and if at all you can place all of these states on the map in the next slide. Here's where Miss Waytes was reported in the newspapers to have spoken: Florida, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Maryland, Massachusetts. Are you placing them on the map? Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Tennessee, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Wisconsin. Her tour was marked by passion, fortitude, and an enduring commitment to women's rights and the Christian social gospel. How does she carry her message to so many places in such a short period of time? Well, likely by train. The map that you see here is a map of train routes in the United States, Canada, and Mexico in 1918. And you can see from the little gray lines that there were trains everywhere. Train travel was the primary way that people traveled long distances before the 1950s in our country. And so we may assume that Miss Waytes rode the train as she traveled from place to place on her extensive speaking tour. Now, not to belabor the obvious, but for those of us who are accustomed to modern conveniences, I'd just like to point out that in 1912 through 1916, which was the most popular part of Miss Waytes' tour, there were no online bookings. There were no Uber rides to the train station. There weren't any of those handy text messages from Amtrak letting you know that your train has been significantly delayed. And Jim Crow laws also affected travel in southern states of the United States. So when Miss Waytes was traveling between and within northern states, she likely would ride on integrated cars. But if she was traveling, for example, from Massachusetts to Tennessee, likely she would have been required to change cars to move into a segregated or colored car when she reached state lines. And within southern states, if she were hungry or thirsty, she likely would not be able to have bought a snack in the lunch bar at the train station. If she needed to use the restroom, she would have been required to use the one marked colored women and not the other one, which could have been marked ladies' parlor. An asset Miss Waytes had that is not to be underestimated was a vast network of supporters and friends throughout the country. According to newspaper accounts, and again, a lot of what we know about Miss Waytes are from reports in the Black press, which was very popular and prolific at that time. According for these accounts, she was always introduced to crowds by religious leaders or civic leaders who had invited her to their city and who felt that her message would be helpful in terms of the goals and the aspirations of their community. This is an era in American history where many African Americans resisted segregation, other forms of discrimination, even violence, by forming self-help organizations, advocacy groups, and benevolent associations. And Miss Waytes' message of hope and self-determination would have been very popular on the circuit of these groups. It's highly likely that she was supported during this time by contributions from the groups to which she spoke. One newspaper account from St. Paul, Minnesota, noted that a collection of $10 had been made and presented Miss Waytes to help her in her good work. Now, I mention these things now because the title of our webinar series is Religious Resolve, and it's amazing to me to consider the resolve, the determination it took for Miss Waytes to travel and to speak as frequently and as extensively as she did at a time when there were so many obstacles and so little conveniences. Then, as now, relationships were critically important. Alice L. Thompson Waytes was born around 1870 in the high country of South Carolina, Union County, which is near the North Carolina border. Before the Civil War, Union County's economy was largely supported by cotton plantations owned by slaveholders and worked by enslaved African Americans, as you can see here in this picture selected by W.E.B. Du Bois for his collection. African Americans at that time made up more than half of the population of Union County. During Reconstruction, when Alice Waytes was born, those African Americans who chose to stay or had to stay in Union County worked on tenant farms and as sharecroppers, making a subsistence living as best they could. Now, the white residents of Union County resisted Reconstruction and the integration of African Americans as full participating citizens in community life. The Union County Ku Klux Klan was the most active in the state after the Civil War. And in 1871, the year after Alice was born, Union County was the scene of the largest KKK raid that ever occurred in the South. In the decades following the war, cotton production slowed due to depletion of the soil. Local farmers suffered until 1893 when a local investor opened a cotton mill that eventually provided thousands of jobs to residents of Union County in nearby areas of North Carolina. But as this photo helps illustrate, only white residents, some of them children, were eligible for hire. The name of this photograph is A Typical Spinner. These young girls were typical spinners in this cotton mill. Black workers who had produced the cotton were not allowed inside the mills. Now, we don't know what this meant for the Waytes family, but by the late 1890s, Alice had taken off, probably on the Spartanburg and Union train. Her young adult life was one of learning and near constant motion. She studied at Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina in the late 1890s, at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1901, and a shout out to the folks from Shaw who are in our audience today, and at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago in 1904. When her formal training was complete and her network of relationships had been built and was expanding in 1906, she became a teacher at the Florida Institute at Live Oak, a school founded by the American Baptist Home Mission Society. In 1910, Ms. Waytes was appointed superintendent of Bible school work for the Church Federation Society of New York, which was described by its leaders as, quote, an interdenominational instrument for sociological ills investigation in the city. In 1911, she became the pastor at the Shiloh Baptist Church in West Medford, Massachusetts. Now, she only held this position for 1 year, but it was there that she developed the persona Miss A.L.T. Waytes of Boston, which followed her along her extensive public speaking career. She combined inspiring messages of social uplift with sermons on Christian values and Christian service. It may have been at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago that the student Alice Waytes came into contact with a strong community of African American women activists, where she developed a deep commitment to the social gospel. The social gospel provides a foundation for activism that applies the teachings of Jesus towards solving American problems, especially those impacting the poor, the oppressed, the disenfranchised. During the early decades of the 20th century, such problems abound. Ms. Waytes' passions focused on issues affecting women and girls. We can see that in her advocacy for women's suffrage. We can see it in her active support for the creation of the Columbia City Mission in South Carolina, the Frederick Douglass Center in Chicago, the Women's Equal Right Club in Minneapolis, and an Association for the Protection of Afro-American Girls in St. Paul. Later in her life, during the Great Depression, Ms. Waytes served as director of the Salem Emergency Bureau in New York. Faith and service were inextricably linked in her mind and her heart. A newspaper account of a speech she gave at Fisk University reported, quote, that the speaker fully convinced all that it was impossible to please God without service. Ms. Waytes was also active in national politics, taking a controversial stand with the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, in the national election of 1912. When Teddy Roosevelt left the Republican Party and formed the Progressive Party that year, Ms. Waytes was one of the African-American women who supported the cause. Now take a close look, I invite you, at these photographs of supporters of the Bull Moose Party. And tell me if you see anyone in either of these photos who looks anything like Miss Alice Waytes. It took a lot of fortitude and resolve for her to do what she did. The party's platform included a commitment to women's suffrage, but the platform only obliquely addressed some of the important labor conditions affecting the African-American community at that time, calling, for example, for the abolition of the convict contract labor system, but generally avoided taking a stand on other issues impacting the African-American community in particular. Ms. Waytes was selected as one of the Progressive Party campaign speakers and traveled on its behalf in Illinois, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, and Minnesota. In recognition, she received a letter from former President Teddy Roosevelt, who indicated that he was very much pleased with her work. Now, the winner of the 1912 presidential election was not Teddy Roosevelt. Rather, it was Woodrow Wilson, whose campaign had most proactively promised that African Americans in America would receive fair treatment. But it was only 3 years into his administration that President Woodrow Wilson hosted a private viewing of the film The Birth of a Nation in the White House. This was a film that stoked white fears of African Americans and glorified the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, it's often credited with having fueled a surge in Klan membership around that time. Nonetheless, Ms. Waytes persisted in her political advocacy. In 1916, she served as chair of the Colored Women's National Republican Committee, and in 1920, she was chosen as alternative delegate in the 21st District of New York. After the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, newspaper accounts indicate that Ms. Waytes continued on the speaking circuit, but with a message more focused on religious themes than women's rights. The Wilmington, Delaware Evening Journal reported in 1922, for example, that Ms. Waytes had preached at Bethel Church on the subject, get ready for this, the power of voice in man and the execution of judgment in divinity. And that she was, quote, coming direct from a large and successful campaign in Atlantic City where hundreds were turned away from each of her meetings. In 1923, the New York Amsterdam News noted her return to the city after an extended trip through Maryland and New Jersey. By 1934, Alice Waytes was living in central Harlem, surrounded by both vibrant creativity and economic devastation as the Harlem Renaissance was nearing an end and the Great Depression still ravaged America's urban centers. Her apartment was near two of the largest and most socially engaged African-American churches in New York City, the Abyssinian Baptist Church, where almost 10,000 members heard the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. preach each Sunday, and the Salem Methodist Episcopal Church, where many of the African-American cultural elite of the Harlem Renaissance worshiped. But Ms. Waytes' pace was slowing, and health challenges may have been holding her back. In 1934, she suffered from an illness that kept her at home for 5 weeks, according to the New York Amsterdam News. By 1940, she was living as a lodger in a house with 6 other adults in Queens, New York. She indicated to the census taker then that she was a teacher who had been unemployed for more than 52 weeks and was looking for work. Miss A.L.T. Waytes of Boston died at the age of 79 in October 1949 in Orangetown, a suburb of New York City. After that, she faded into our country's untold history, as did so many wonderful, dedicated, determined, faith-driven women like herself. Thank you very much for the opportunity to shed a light on her this afternoon. And I'll just mention before we go into our questions that both Miss Waytes' story and the story of Emma France Lancaster are available along with hundreds of others literally on the database that we will give you the URL for in just a few minutes. Here it is, the online biographical dictionary of women's suffrage in the United States. This is the collection of research that Dr. Dublin mentioned in the beginning, and we provided the URL for you here so that you can read these and other fabulous stories. So thank you very much, and Reverend Powell, I'll turn the program back over to you.
Well, wow, that was absolutely excellent to hear about these two wonderful women, particularly in the times of which they had to deal with and what they were fighting for, in addition to the fact that there was still bondage of people of color, African Americans here in America. Now, before reading the questions, we do have a couple questions that have come in. We want to read those before we go to the chat. But as was mentioned earlier, you may be wondering how you can get involved or learn more about the women's suffrage, suffragists. And as Mrs. Forlow mentioned, she's giving you the website on the PowerPoint, and I've also inserted it in the chat. So let's just go to our questions. And if you have questions, please just type them in the chat and we will definitely try to address them. Again, thank you, Ms. Forlow, for that those details on such a phenomenal woman. The first question we had sent to us is, how do religions work together to secure the vote for women, and how they can work together today to uphold the right to vote and to affect the exercise of that right, even against apathy and disenfranchisement? So
let me take a first try, and I'm sure that we'll have Blair will probably have some comments to make as well. And what I would say is that in the 19th century, there was something of a struggle within the Black church, as women members of those congregations called for greater participation in those churches, where they wanted the ordination ministers, of women ministers. They wanted the appointment of deaconesses to join the deacons and in various ways contribute to the governance of the church. And in these initial struggles within the church, women came to gain a voice, to gain more confidence, and to increase their demands, and then to take those demands from within the church world to bring it out into the secular world as well, and to call for the right to vote, to call for various other improvements in women's circumstances in that period. So it seems to me the church was a real kind of an early playing field for women in these movements, and the church gave them confidence. If all were equal before God in the eyes of Jesus, then certainly they should be equal in the secular world as well. So I think that the church played a crucial role in that regard and continues. If we think about the Moral Mondays that have emerged in North Carolina under the leadership of Reverend Barber, you can see the church has continued to play that kind of a role, the conscience of the broader society, and has played a role in opposition to voter suppression, in the effort to register more people to vote, and to, in general, engage the issues of American society today.
Excellent. And we also know that we have seen and from various activists, more often than not, particularly during those times, these activists really stem from the church because of what is seen, that correction or some light need to be brought to it, you know. So yeah, that is very, very good information to have, and it coincides in exactly what we see repetitively. And so Ms. Forlow, you have anything?
Well, I would just echo everything that that Tom Dublin has said, and I'll just also mention I noticed that the NAACP now has a program called Souls to the Polls, and there are other religiously based, cross-denominational, interfaith efforts, interesting things that are happening at the local level where local mosques, synagogues, and churches are coming together to encourage local communities to register and to get out to vote. And these are nonpartisan initiatives that just want to encourage people to exercise their right to vote. I just wanted to mention one thing about the story of Emma France Lancaster that that we heard about in Oregon, because I was under the impression that there were no African Americans in Oregon when we started this this research. But as Dr. Dublin has pointed out, there was a small but very vibrant African American community in Portland, and I thought it was interesting that you described, was it 3 churches, Tom, who had come together, banded together, 3 Black churches to advance rights of women and women's suffrage. And that seems to me that it's at the local level where these partnerships and relationships really are easiest to put together and really pay off.
Okay, so our next question we have, unless you would like to respond to that question, Professor Dublin, or?
I'm good.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, so our next question is, what religions have been notable in this cause? And so I think this also kind of before for one of either one of you respond to that question. In your presentation, Professor Dublin, you mentioned about the Baptists and the Methodists, where Mrs. Lancaster had gotten her start, and then we talked about a lot. I'm sorry, as far as once she relocated, because we know about the Quakers there, but that the overall start is what I want to say for most people as activists have come out of the Baptist or the Methodist. So let me clean that up. And then this question was asked: what religions and that is true with history, but we also finding that there are other religions and faiths that are beginning to be more active than what is commonly known. So I want to just turn that question over to you or Mrs. Forlaw to respond to that general question that was asked.
Well, the Baptist Church was a real center of activism, and Elizabeth Higginbotham has written about that and the work of Nannie Helen Burroughs in particular. So efforts to gain the ordination of women, efforts to have women have a larger say in the governance of churches. The Baptist Church was very important with the Baptist Convention that met over all these years, and the AME Church was not really far behind in that regard. And so that within each of these denominations, the women's movement took root, and the activity then led to interdenominational cooperation, as we saw in Portland, in my case, where 3 churches that are all really quite small come together and offer their services to the women's suffrage movement. And these were places where they could meet, places where they were comfortable, places where they could get the message out to a larger audience. And the churches were very important in that process.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so let's go to our chat, and we do have a question here in our chat. So the question asks is, well, basically we provided that for the link there. It says, may we have citations for Professor Jones's work that links early African-American women with Jarena Lee to later suffragists like Emma Lancaster? And then they say, thanks. So
that book is entitled Vanguard. It has come out really just earlier this month. And the author, again, is Martha S. Jones, and it's a very important work. Let me just read its longer title. Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. So she makes this connection very well in a book that is fresh off the press.
Excellent. Excellent. And so here's a question. What similarities do you see with the challenges Mrs. Lancaster and Mrs. Waytes faced in fighting for voting rights or women's rights, or basically voting rights, and what we see occurring in this present time as it pertains to a lot of the things we're hearing in the news with voting and some of the barriers? Either one doesn't really matter.
Well, I would just observe that we struggle still today with resistance to equal participation by women,
Mm-hmm.
by African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
and by other groups such as Native Americans, in many aspects of full citizenship, including voting. And so we can take lessons and courage from the 2 women that we talked about today, because they didn't give up in the face of incredible obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
On the same point though, it's discouraging that 100 years after the lives of these women, we're still struggling with some of the obstacles that they faced. But part of our reasoning today in presenting these stories is to affirm the work and the passion that they put into these causes, and to hopefully take inspiration, those of us who were proponents of voting today, to take courage and determination from them to persist in this effort.
Well, thank you. And so we do not have any more questions in the chat box, and looks like we've gone beyond our allotted time here. So that, unless either one of our presenters have any comments, this is going to conclude the Religious Freedom Center's Leadership for Multi-Faith Democracy's second program. And so I did put in the chat box there if you want to know more about the upcoming events and the programs that have been coordinated, a newsletter at freedomforum.org. You can go there, and if you have any questions about the series that are being conducted, you can contact Mrs. Blair Forlaw, and her personal email address has been placed in the chat box for you as well at bforlaw@freedomforum.org. And we'd like to thank you for joining us and hope you have been enlightened and motivated to learn more. I am Reverend Tess Powell of Perfecting Community Full Gospel Baptist Ministry, Community Change Agent, your moderator for today. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.